welcome in, and thank you so much for joining us for this highly anticipated deep dive.
Yeah, it's a big one today.
It really is. But before we go a single second further into today's material, I need you to do me a massive favor.
Very important.
Exactly. Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now.
Do it right now.
You are not going to want to miss a moment of what we are unpacking today. Your support is exactly what allows us to keep bringing you these incredibly thorough explorations.
And we really appreciate it.
We do. So today we have a stack of material centered around an exceptionally provocative, ultra-long and incisive new ebook.
Oh, yeah.
It's titled Help, My Wife is an Evil Bitch by Conrad Riker.
Quite the title.
It grabs you.
Oh.
Now, let me be very clear right out of the gate about who this specific deep dive is going to be most fascinating for.
Right, the target audience.
Yeah. If you are someone who is interested in the men's rights movement, or if you follow red-pilled manosphere theories, or if you're simply invested in understanding the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
This is absolutely tailor-made for you.
Exactly. The book frames itself as a radical, unapologetic manual. It claims to expose the hidden structural architecture of modern society.
And it does not hold back.
Not even a little. I will tell you right now, if you want your worldview fundamentally challenged, or if you want to fully digest this massive paradigm-shifting text, you absolutely need to buy the ebook right now.
Highly recommend getting the source material.
Yeah, it is available on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and you need to follow the author at Conrad and Riker at his Substack.
Got to get it straight from the source.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack the central thesis of this massive book. We're looking at understanding the history and the current state of our cultural, legal, and economic institutions through the very specific, highly controversial lens the author provides.
And before we dive into the substance of those arguments, I need to provide a firm, unequivocal disclaimer to you, the listener.
Very crucial rule for us, too.
Absolutely crucial. The contents of this book are highly politically charged. They touch on some of the most polarizing cultural, gender, and political debates of our entire era.
Yeah.
So we must explicitly state that we, as your hosts, are never taking a side here.
Never.
We are not endorsing the controversial viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them.
We're just the messengers.
Right. Our job today is purely to act as your impartial guides. We are here to rigorously analyze, deconstruct, and report the exact arguments, the philosophical frameworks, and the logical structures presented in the original source material.
Just laying it all out.
We are looking at this text as a cultural artifact of modern manosphere philosophy to understand exactly how the author constructs his worldview, piece by piece.
Okay, with that established, I want to jump right into the deep end, because Riker doesn't waste any time.
He really doesn't.
Early on, he introduces this overarching concept he calls the gynocentric matrix.
Yes, foundational to the whole book.
And he's not using this as a loose metaphor. He essentially argues that modern society is a meticulously constructed simulation, or like a highly optimized system.
Designed for one primary, unstated purpose.
Exactly. The extraction of male labor, male resources, and male dignity.
Yeah.
And the kicker is, he claims the system is so effective because it convinces men that their servitude is actually a virtue.
That's the insidious part he focuses on.
Right. To illustrate this, the book uses a really detailed anecdote in chapter 1 about a guy named Marcus.
Ah, Marcus.
Yeah, help me understand how Marcus fits into this theory.
So Marcus is presented as the archetype of the highly successful, productive modern male, and Riker uses his story as a foundational case study.
A sort of cautionary tale.
Very much so. The book describes Marcus as a logistics titan.
Yeah.
We are talking about a man who built a generational fortune literally from the ground up, starting with the dust of a single delivery van.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
What? Literally. Riker paints this vivid picture of a man navigating razor-thin profit margins for 20 years. He's waking up at 4 a.m., dealing with the stress of payroll, supply chain collapses.
Just the physical and mental toll of carrying an entire enterprise on his back.
Exactly. And through all of this brutal labor, he provides a lifestyle for his family that the text says would make a sultan blush.
Wow.
We're talking the sprawling suburban estate, the private schools, the luxury vehicles.
Right, he's doing exactly what society tells a man he's supposed to do. He is being the ultimate provider.
Precisely. He is fulfilling the traditional male contract to the letter. But then, Riker introduces the catalyst,
The wife.
Marcus's wife, who the book explicitly notes never loaded a single pallet, never dealt with a logistics crisis, and never contributed to the actual creation of this wealth.
Okay.
She decides she is simply unhappy. She states she doesn't feel loved.
Just a feeling.
It's just a subjective emotional state. And according to the text, that feeling is all it takes to trigger the legal machinery of the state. She hires a lawyer, and the family court system completely dismantles Marcus's life and his empire.
It's just gutted.
The book describes the aftermath. Marcus ends up living in a 300-square-foot studio apartment, financially gutted by alimony and asset division.
While she continues to drive his Mercedes.
And burned through the wealth he sacrificed his life to build. Riker uses this story not as an example of a freak accident or a particularly bad marriage.
Right, he says this is a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. He argues this is the standard operating procedure of a system purposefully designed to plunder male productivity.
That is an incredibly bleak picture. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt like you're doing everything right, working 50 hours a week, paying your taxes, trying to be a good partner, but you still feel like you're constantly on the losing end of the deal, this is the exact psychological friction Riker is trying to name.
He's given it a vocabulary.
But he doesn't just leave it as an emotional story, does he? I notice he moves straight from Marcus into what looks like a full-blown accounting audit to prove this matrix exists.
He does. Riker is very systematic. He shifts from the emotional narrative into a cold, comparative financial analysis.
So the numbers game.
Yeah, he wants to prove mathematically what he calls the beta provider tax.
Okay, walk us through that.
He sets up a comparison between two hypothetical men of equal skill and earning potential. He calls them Steve the single and Gary the married.
Catchy.
Let's say both are software engineers making $150,000 a year. According to the text's breakdown, Steve the single retains the vast majority of his disposable income.
Because he's only paying for himself.
Right. He lives below his means, he invests in index funds, he buys Bitcoin, he travels, his money compounds, building a fortress of personal freedom and sovereignty.
And then there's Gary.
Right. Gary. Despite earning the exact same amount, Gary is subjected to this beta provider tax.
Where does the money go?
Riker argues that Gary's net worth is systematically eroded by 1,000 line items that serve absolutely no productive purpose. The book details things like constant wardrobe upgrades for the wife, aesthetic home renovations.
Oh, there was that great example.
The paint.
Yeah, Riker uses an example of a wife demanding a room be painted beige twice in 6 months because the first beige had the wrong undertones.
Yes. Endless lifestyle inflation that services her social status among her peers, rather than his wealth accumulation.
So the argument is that Gary's labor is being siphoned off for vanity projects, essentially.
Yes. The text asserts a very striking economic claim based on consumer data. It claims that while women, on average, earn a fraction of the male dollar across the broader economy, they control approximately 85% of all consumer spending.
85%, that's massive.
Riker frames this as undeniable proof of the extraction matrix. He concludes that modern marriage is the single greatest wealth destroyer for a high-value male. He uses a very specific mechanical metaphor to drive this home. He states that in the vehicle of marriage, the man is the engine. He does all the burning, all the pushing, all the heavy lifting.
And the woman.
She is merely the vanity license plate claiming ownership of the ride.
Okay, I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener.
Sure.
Because a lot of people would hear that and say, well, marriage is a partnership. It's a contract that two people enter into willingly. If Gary doesn't like how the money is spent, he can leave. How does Riker address the actual legal mechanics of the marriage contract itself?
That exact question leads Riker into a deep dive on contract law in Chapter 4. And this is where his background research really shows.
It gets very technical here.
He sets up a foundational legal syllogism. In traditional Western law, a valid contract fundamentally requires a few things: an offer, an acceptance, mutual consideration, meaning both parties bring something of value to the table. And, crucially, recourse for a breach. If you sign a contract with a vendor to deliver steel, and they don't deliver the steel, there are penalties. You don't still have to pay them.
That's just basic business logic. You break the deal, you face consequences.
But Riker argues that modern marriage fails this test entirely. His perspective is that if one party, specifically the wife, can unilaterally void the agreement at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, face absolutely no penalty for breaking the contract, and still retain the spoils of the other party's labor through alimony and asset division, then you do not have a contract.
What do you have then?
The book argues that what you actually have is a state-sponsored scam.
And he specifically points the finger at no-fault divorce as the mechanism for this scam, right?
He absolutely does.
Because conventionally, no-fault divorce was celebrated as a way to allow people to escape genuinely toxic or abusive situations without having to go through a drawn-out traumatic court battle to prove adultery or abuse.
Yes, but Riker views no-fault divorce through an entirely different lens. He frames it as a deceptive instrument of entrapment.
How so?
The book cites data suggesting that women currently initiate nearly 70% of all divorces,
70%.
often utilizing what the text calls the walkaway wife syndrome, where a woman secretly plans her exit for years before suddenly dropping the paperwork.
Just blindside the guy.
Yet, despite initiating the dissolution of the contract, Riker points out they receive roughly 80% of custodial awards and the corresponding marital assets.
So they break the contract and get the payout.
He explicitly frames this legal architecture as a massive institutionalized wealth transfer from the productive class, which he identifies as men, to a grievance class.
He also goes after the family court system itself, specifically something called the Duluth model. I had heard of this in passing regarding domestic dispute interventions, but he elevates it to something much more sinister. What exactly is the Duluth model, and why is Riker so focused on it?
The Duluth model is a framework developed in the 1980s for responding to domestic violence. But Riker describes it in the book as the unquestionable religious dogma of the family court system.
Dogma is a strong word.
According to the text, the Duluth model operates on a fundamental sociological assumption that domestic violence is not about individual pathology or mutual conflict, but is inherently a tool of patriarchal power and control used by men to subjugate women.
Meaning the framework itself is gendered from the start.
Exactly. Riker argues that this framework assumes male guilt by default. If the police are called to a domestic dispute, the Duluth model's underlying philosophy heavily implies the man is the primary aggressor simply by virtue of being male in a patriarchal society.
Just because of his biology.
The text argues that this rejects 2,500 years of Western Enlightenment values. It throws objective evidence, the presumption of innocence, and due process out the window, and replaces it with the modern cultural mantra of believe all women.
So feelings over facts, legally speaking.
Riker views this not just as unfair, but as an epistemological disaster. He claims it establishes a legal precedent where subjective feelings and accusations are treated as superior to objective reality and empirical evidence.
So if we follow his logic, he's saying men are voluntarily signing a contract that guarantees their own destruction, overseen by a court system that presumes their guilt.
That's the premise.
Which begs the obvious question to you, the listener. Why on earth do men keep doing it? Why get married at all if the math and the law are that bad?
That is the pivotal transition in the book. Riker argues that men are essentially fighting their own evolutionary programming. To explain why this dynamic exists, he shifts from legal and economic arguments directly into the biological realm.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
He leans heavily into evolutionary psychology, specifically referencing concepts popularized by prominent researchers like Dr. David Buss.
Right, he starts talking about the biological imperative. He uses this phrase, the dichotomy of alpha fucks / beta bucks. Break that down for us, because it sounds like a very crude internet slang term, but he uses it as a core biological theory.
It originated in the manosphere, but Riker attempts to ground it in evolutionary biology. The argument is that the female biological imperative, honed over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, is essentially a dual mating strategy.
Two distinct goals.
On one hand, she needs to secure the highest possible quality genetic material to ensure strong offspring. This is the alpha, the physically dominant, exciting, often risk-taking male.
The bad boy.
On the other hand, human infants take an incredibly long time to mature, meaning she simultaneously needs to secure the maximum level of resource provisioning and safety. This is the beta, the reliable, hardworking, compliant provider.
And historically, those two traits rarely exist in the same guy. The risk taker who fights off predators isn't always the guy who wants to stay home and farm the crops.
Exactly. So Riker posits that women have an evolutionary imperative of deceit. They are biologically wired for hypergamy, which is the instinctual drive to constantly seek a higher status mate.
Constantly trading up.
He also uses the term branch swinging, comparing this instinct to a monkey moving through trees. A woman will not let go of one resource provider until she has a firm, secure grasp on a better, higher status one.
This brings us to one of the most controversial concepts in the book, the idea of the alpha widow. He uses this to explain why even marriages that look perfect on paper, where Gary, the software engineer, is providing a great life, still fall apart. What is an alpha widow?
Riker defines an alpha widow as a woman who, in her youth and peak fertility, paired with a high-status, exciting, perhaps even dangerous alpha male. The book claims that this intense primal experience permanently calibrates her neurochemistry.
Her brain is literally rewired.
Her baseline for sexual attraction and romantic thrill is set to that specific high-drama frequency.
Okay, so she has this wild romance in her 20s, but then she hits 30, realizes the bad boy isn't going to pay the mortgage, and she settles down with Gary.
Right. She marries the reliable, provisioning beta male because her logical brain knows she needs financial security and a safe environment for children.
Makes sense on paper.
But Riker argues that because her neurochemistry was permanently altered by the alpha, she is biologically and psychologically incapable of truly pair bonding with the beta provider.
Wow.
She may appreciate his money, but she doesn't deeply desire him. The author argues that over time, she will harbor a deep-seated subconscious resentment toward this provider.
Resentment for what? Providing.
She resents him because his mere presence reminds her that she had to settle for safety over primal attraction. According to the text, this biological mismatch leads to a permanent, simmering state of antagonism in the home. The wife will constantly test, nag, and belittle the husband, punishing him for not being the alpha she actually desires.
And Riker paints an incredibly vivid picture of what that antagonism actually looks like day to day. There was this one section in Chapter 8 that really caught my eye. He calls it the Tuesday Night Holocaust.
A very dramatic title.
When I first read that heading, I thought it was incredibly extreme. What exactly is he talking about there?
It is a deliberately provocative title for a very mundane domestic situation.
Yeah.
And he uses it to explain a psychological concept called female solipsism.
Okay, break that down.
Let me paint the picture he uses in the book. He asks you to imagine a man returning home at 7 p.m. He's exhausted from a grueling 10-hour day of corporate warfare labor that strictly funds the household.
He's drained.
He walks in the door, and his wife asks for the specific artisanal brand of vanilla soy milk she likes. The husband realizes he forgot to stop at the store.
A completely normal, minor oversight happens to everyone.
Exactly. But the text claims that in an instant, the wife's reaction escalates to an apocalyptic level. Because she feels slighted, her internal emotional state dictates her reality.
Her feelings become facts.
She conflates her feelings with objective facts. It isn't just that he forgot the milk. Her feeling of disappointment means that he doesn't care about her, he doesn't respect her, and he is willfully neglecting her needs.
So it's not about the milk at all.
The book uses this to illustrate a solipsistic feedback loop. Riker argues that the modern woman often lacks the conceptual framework to separate her internal emotional weather from external objective reality. If she feels oppressed, she is objectively oppressed, regardless of the data or the husband's actual intentions.
That is fascinating. It's like arguing that for her, the emotion itself is the undeniable proof of the crime. So how does the husband usually respond in Riker's scenario?
To dissect the husband's response, Riker utilizes a well-known psychological model called the Cartman Drama Triangle.
I've heard of this in therapy contexts.
This triangle consists of three roles: the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. The book claims that modern wives are masters at weaponizing this triangle, using it as a zero-sum game to extract attention, emotional energy, and resources from their husbands.
Walk me through how that applies to the soy milk fight.
Sure. In the soy milk scenario, she initiates the conflict as the victim. She sighs, acts distressed, and claims she is neglected and unheard.
And the husband?
The husband, programmed by society to protect women, immediately jumps into the role of the rescuer. He apologizes profusely, grabs his keys, and rushes back out into the night to find an open grocery store.
He tries to fix it.
But here is the trap. Riker argues she will never let him truly rescue her. If he returns with regular soy milk instead of vanilla, she instantly pivots to the persecutor role.
The flip.
She berates his incompetence, claiming he can't even do one simple task right. The author argues this isn't an accident. It is a deliberate, albeit subconscious, psychological warfare protocol designed to keep the male off balance, constantly seeking approval and inducing a state of learned helplessness.
And Riker doesn't just isolate this to individual marriages. He scales this dynamic up to the macro level, suggesting that all of society treats women this way. He brings up sociological concepts, specifically something he calls the empathy gap. And he cites a specific study from 1994 by Eagly and Mladinik. What is the Women Are Wonderful effect?
The 1994 Eagly and Mladinik study is a cornerstone of this section. The researchers found that both men and women consistently assign more positive traits to women than to men.
So everyone just naturally likes women more.
Riker uses this empirical data to argue that society suffers from a massive, ingrained psychological bias, what he calls a sociopsychic firewall. Because of this empathy gap, society automatically associates women with innocence, virtue, and vulnerability, rushing to protect them and validate their feelings.
Men.
Conversely, society inherently views men with suspicion, assuming they are aggressive or culpable.
So if a woman cries, the world stops to ask who hurt her. If a man cries, the world tells him to man up.
Precisely. Riker argues this translates to systemic misandry. He points out that male pain, male homelessness, and male depression are routinely treated with contempt or ridicule by society, while female discomfort is treated as a national crisis requiring federal funding.
Okay, let me make sure I'm following the architecture of this argument so far.
Yeah.
We've got the economic and legal extraction matrix, we've got the biological imperative of hypergamy, and we've got the psychological weaponization of solipsism and the empathy gap.
Right. That's the foundation.
But how did society get to this point? Has it always been this way, or did something change? Because Riker points a very direct, aggressive finger at cultural Marxism and a deliberate rhetorical war on masculinity.
This is where Riker transitions from biology to political history. He traces the origin of this systemic shift directly back to the mid-20th century, specifically targeting the Frankfurt School.
The academics.
He cites Marxist theorists like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, and he heavily relies on Antonio Gramsci's concept of the long march through the institutions.
For the listener who might not be familiar with 20th century political philosophy, give me the explain like I'm 5 on the Frankfurt School and what they supposedly did.
The simplest way to understand Riker's thesis here is this. After World War I, traditional Marxists realized that the working class in Western capitalist countries were never going to rise up in a violent, bloody revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie.
Capitalism had made them too comfortable.
So theorists like Gramsci proposed a new strategy. Instead of a violent overthrow of the government, Marxists needed to quietly infiltrate and conquer the cultural institutions that define society. The universities, the media, the entertainment industry, and the legal system.
A cultural revolution instead of an economic one.
Exactly. And the book's core claim is that these intellectuals deliberately identified the foundational pillar of Western culture, the nuclear family. They realized that a strong, self-sufficient family unit, led by a patriarchal father figure, was inherently resistant to state control.
It's an independent unit.
Therefore, the text claims their explicit goal was to sever the bond between husband and wife, destroy the moral and cultural authority of the male, and atomize the individual. If you destroy the family unit, women and children become totally reliant on the state as a surrogate provider, and men become demoralized, taxable drones.
I have to say, he uses a highly provocative, deeply controversial term for the rhetorical engine driving this agenda. He calls it men camp.
Yeah, that's a heavily loaded term.
He is explicitly comparing the modern, systematic demonization of men by HR departments and media to the propaganda machines of the 1930s. How exactly does he connect those two dots? That is a massive, highly aggressive leap.
It is a massive leap, and it's meant to be jarring. The perspective he offers is based on the mechanics of propaganda. He argues that just as 1930s propaganda was used to characterize a specific demographic group as an oppressive, greedy caste dominating the globe, all to justify stripping them of their assets and humanity. Modern cultural Marxism uses the exact same playbook against the modern male.
He calls it the big lie strategy, right?
Yes. The argument is that if you repeat the lie often enough that the patriarchy is the source of all historical evil, that men are inherently violent oppressors, that masculinity itself is toxic, the masses will eventually embrace it as undeniable truth.
It just becomes accepted reality.
The book claims this rhetoric is purposefully designed to rationalize the absolute social, legal, and financial dispossession of the men who actually built and maintained civilization. If men are evil oppressors, then stealing their wealth via family court or denying them jobs via diversity quotas isn't theft or discrimination, it's cosmic justice.
And to fight this, Riker sets up a deep philosophical dichotomy. He talks about logos versus eros. What do those terms mean in the context of this culture war?
Riker uses these classical Greek terms to represent the two opposing forces in his worldview. He defines logos as the divine masculine principle. It represents reason, objective truth, empirical data, structural order, and the ability to delay gratification.
It is the force that builds bridges and writes code.
He contrasts this with eros, which he frames as the feminine principle. In his definition, eros is driven by primal emotion, subjective feelings, immediate gratification, and chaotic disorder.
And he claims society has abandoned logos for eros. He specifically attacks an academic framework called standpoint epistemology. I know this is a concept heavily debated in universities right now. How does Riker define it, and why does he hate it so much?
Standpoint epistemology is essentially the academic theory that a person's lived experience, particularly if they belong to a marginalized group, holds a higher truth value than objective reality or empirical data.
Your truth versus the truth.
It argues that because of systemic biases, objective truth might not actually exist, and we must defer to the emotional reality of the oppressed.
So if someone feels something happened a certain way, their feeling is just as valid as video evidence proving otherwise.
That is precisely how Riker interprets it. He frames standpoint epistemology as an occultist inversion of logic. He argues it is a system that essentially dictates that 2 plus 2 can equal 5, so long as a woman or a minority feels sad about the result of 4. It elevates female eros above male logos, completely destroying the foundation of Western scientific inquiry.
So what is his solution to this? Because he doesn't just complain about it, he offers a tactical intellectual defense for men. He calls for reclaiming the trivium.
The trivium is the classical education model consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Riker urges men to study classical Aristotelian logic, specifically the law of non-contradiction, the idea that two opposing statements cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense.
Very foundational logic.
He wants men to use this strict, unyielding logic to refuse the feminist frame. The book teaches men a tactical approach. Never engage in emotional arguments. Completely dismantle subjective complaints with cold, hard, empirical data.
Give me an example of how he applies that. How does he use data to dismantle the idea of male privilege?
He does it by hijacking leftist analytical tools, specifically intersectionality, and completely flipping them.
Using their own weapons.
Intersectionality generally argues that we should measure oppression by looking at who suffers the most systemic harm, marginalization, and death. Riker says, okay, let's play by those exact rules. He then cites data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He points out that men account for roughly 92% of all workplace fatalities.
He calls it the glass cellar, right, as opposed to the glass ceiling.
Exactly. The glass ceiling complains about a lack of female CEOs, but the glass cellar points out that men are the ones suffocating in coal mines, falling off oil rigs, and getting electrocuted, maintaining the power grid so that society can function comfortably.
The dangerous jobs.
Furthermore, the book points out that male suicide rates are consistently 3 to 4 times higher than female rates across the Western world. Riker constructs a devastating logical syllogism.
Let's hear it.
If oppression is strictly defined by systemic suffering, forced, dangerous labor, and premature death, and men disproportionately suffer all of these fates to ensure the physical survival and comfort of women, then historically and presently, men are the disposable workhorses of civilization, not the privileged oppressors.
That concept of male disposability is a huge theme in the book, and it leads directly into what I found to be the most fascinating and frankly jarring sections of the text, chapter 14, where he completely rewrites, or as he would say, corrects historical narratives.
He takes on all the big myths.
He sarcastically refers to the mainstream historical consensus as herstory, and he uses the sinking of the Titanic as his primary piece of evidence. I always thought of the Titanic as just a tragedy of hubris, a lack of lifeboats.
Yeah.
How does Riker use it to prove male disposability?
He looks strictly at the survival math. The survival rate for women on the Titanic was around 74%. The survival rate for men was barely 20%. Riker claims this massive disparity isn't a historical anomaly. It is the ultimate, undeniable expression of what he calls the hero's trap.
Meaning society expects men to die so women can live.
Yes. The women and children first protocol. Riker argues that the men on the Titanic, many of whom were the wealthiest, most powerful men in the world at the time, men who supposedly benefited from this massive patriarchal privilege, willingly stood on the deck of a freezing, sinking ship and chose to drown in the dark so that third-class female passengers could take the lifeboats.
They sacrificed themselves.
Riker's perspective is that a society that expects its supposed oppressors to routinely lay down their lives for the oppressed is not a patriarchy at all. It is a covert matriarchy that treats male life as fundamentally cheap and expendable.
He is absolutely relentless in auditing these historical narratives. He even goes after Rosie the Riveter. Now, Rosie the Riveter is an untouchable cultural icon, The "We Can Do It" poster is everywhere. It represents the moment women proved they could do men's jobs. How does he try to debunk that?
He frames the Rosie narrative as a massive campaign of stolen valor. The text acknowledges that women did indeed enter the factories during World War II. However, Riker points out that these women were primarily operating in safe domestic environments, assembling components on assembly lines.
And the men.
The book argues that men had already invented the tools, engineered the assembly processes, built the factories brick by brick, and mined the raw iron ore from the earth, all before shipping off to be physically slaughtered in the mud of European trenches or burned alive in the Pacific.
So his argument is that women stepped into a turnkey system built entirely by men while the men went off to die.
Correct. The book claims that elevating Rosie the Riveter to the same heroic status as the men storming the beaches of Normandy is a deliberate rhetorical strategy designed to transfer unearned moral capital to a demographic that entirely avoided combat.
He makes a similar comparison using World War I. He contrasts the famous 1914 Christmas truce with something called the White Feather Campaign. I had never heard of the White Feather Campaign before reading this. What was it?
The contrast he draws here is stark. The 1914 Christmas truce is historically documented. British and German soldiers spontaneously stopped shooting each other, climbed out of the trenches, exchanged gifts, and played football in no man's land. Riker uses this to illustrate an inherent noble male brotherhood and a natural inclination toward logos and peace when left to their own devices.
But then he points back home to England.
Right. Back home, women were participating in the White Feather Campaign. This was a movement where women would publicly hand white feathers, a symbol of cowardice, to any man they saw walking the streets, not in military uniform.
Public shaming.
The goal was to publicly shame and socially destroy men who hadn't enlisted. Riker argues this proves that women actively coerced and shamed men into marching into the meat grinder of trench warfare, safely cheering them on from a distance while enforcing male disposability.
He also takes on the historical narrative of the witch hunts. If you take a gender studies class, the witch hunts are often presented as the ultimate proof of historical misogynistic genocide, the patriarchy burning independent women at the stake. How does he mathematically challenge that narrative?
Riker approaches this with pure statistical ruthlessness.
What?
The book notes that modern historical consensus puts the death toll of the European witch hunts at roughly 40,000 to 60,000 people over a period of 3 centuries.
Which is terrible.
Riker acknowledges this was tragic and unjust. However, he argues that framing a death toll of 50,000 over 300 years as the ultimate historical atrocity is statistically hysterical when you compare it to the hundreds of millions of men who were conscripted, enslaved, and slaughtered in endless territorial wars over that exact same period.
So he's saying feminism hyper-focuses on the witch hunts to claim ultimate victimhood, while completely ignoring the mountains of male corpses that history is built upon.
Exactly. And furthermore, the author claims this victim-centric narrative deliberately obscures the reality of who actually built the modern world. He argues that men invented and constructed virtually all of the infrastructure that allows modern feminists to complain about men on the internet, from the electrical grid and deep-sea fiber optic cables to calculus, the internal combustion engine, and the polio vaccine.
He flips the script entirely.
He frames history as a story of male genius and sacrifice that has been rewritten to sound like a story of female oppression.
If we connect this erasure of the past to the shaping of the future, Riker argues that this systemic war on the masculine spirit doesn't just happen in history books. It is happening right now to young boys. He dedicates a huge section to what he calls the educational indoctrination complex.
Yes, he argues the subjugation begins in elementary school. The book details the current boy crisis in education. According to the text, the modern public education system is an overwhelmingly female-dominated environment, both in teaching staff and administrative policy. Riker claims this environment inherently pathologizes natural male kinetic energy.
Meaning, boys are naturally physical, they need to run around, play fight, establish hierarchies, and the school system treats that as a disease.
Exactly. The system demands boys sit perfectly still in a desk for 8 hours a day, which is a behavioral model better suited for young girls. When boys naturally rebel against this unnatural constraint, the book claims the system punishes them. Riker draws a direct line from this female-centric environment to the massive overdiagnosis of ADHD in young boys.
He uses a really chilling phrase for that. He calls it chemical lobotomization.
He does. He argues that putting millions of young boys on amphetamines like Ritalin and Adderall is not a medical necessity. It is a tool of social control. The argument is that the matriarchal system purposefully drugs the warrior spirit out of the boy before he can even figure out who he is.
Just numbs them out.
The ultimate goal, according to Riker, is to strip boys of their aggression and independence, molding them into compliant, docile, cubicle drones who will blindly pay their taxes to fund the state.
And if a boy survives elementary school and high school without being medicated into submission, Riker claims the trap snaps shut completely at the university level. He specifically points to the rise of university Title IX tribunals. Now, a lot of listeners might remember the Obama-era Dear Colleague letter that changed how colleges handle sexual assault allegations. Riker views this as an absolute destruction of civil rights. Why?
Riker's analysis here focuses on the burden of proof. In a legitimate court of law, to destroy a man's life with a criminal conviction, you must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The book argues that the Dear Colleague letter effectively stripped male college students of their constitutional rights to due process by forcing universities to lower the burden of proof in sexual misconduct cases to a mere preponderance of evidence.
And what does that mean in mathematical terms?
It means just a 50.01% likelihood. If a campus tribunal thinks it is slightly more likely than not that an offense occurred, based on testimony alone, a young man can be expelled, his academic record ruined, and his future destroyed.
Based on essentially a coin flip?
Furthermore, these tribunals often denied the accused the right to cross-examine their accusers or have legal representation present. Riker frames these university hearings as modern-day Star Chamber's kangaroo courts, specifically designed to terrorize young men, remind them of their expendable status, and reinforce the overarching narrative that female accusation is synonymous with objective truth.
Okay, so we've covered the cultural, historical, and legal traps, but Riker argues that the ultimate mechanism enforcing all of this is money. It always comes back to money. He introduces a macroeconomic theory he calls the transference economy, and he bases this on aggregated IRS tax data. What is the transference economy?
The text relies on sweeping demographic tax data to make a foundational economic claim that men, as an aggregate demographic, are net positive tax contributors over their lifetimes. This means they pay significantly more money into the government system via income tax, corporate tax, and capital gains than they ever take out in services.
They are the engine.
Right. Conversely, the book claims that women, as an aggregate demographic, are net consumers of state resources. Because women generally earn less, pay less in overall taxes, live longer, and utilize the vast majority of welfare, subsidized healthcare, and state-funded social services, they extract more from the system than they put in.
So Rikers is saying the government is essentially playing Robin Hood, but instead of rich to poor, it's male to female.
Exactly. He argues that this creates a massive parasitic economic structure, where the state effectively acts as a surrogate husband. The welfare state, according to this view, is simply a bureaucratic mechanism for forcefully transferring wealth from productive working men to dependent women.
And it's not optional.
And this transfer isn't voluntary. It is enforced at the barrel of a gun through the threat of imprisonment for tax evasion or unpaid child support.
But he doesn't just stop at taxes. He gets into the actual plumbing of the financial system itself. He points the finger directly at the Federal Reserve and the use of fiat currency. He brings up a term that crypto enthusiasts use a lot, the Cantillon effect. Explain the Cantillon effect to the listener and how Riker connects it to this gender war.
The author brings up the Cantillon effect to explain the hidden mechanics of wealth theft. Imagine you're at a massive stadium concert, and you're the very first person in line at the merchandise stand. You get the limited edition t-shirt at the normal printed price. But as the shirts start running out, the guys at the back of the line have to buy them from scalpers for triple the price. The author argues that fiat currency money printed out of thin air by the central bank works the exact same way.
So the people closest to the money printer get the benefit.
Exactly. The government, the massive banks, the defense contractors, and the institutions that administer the welfare state get the newly printed money first, before prices have a chance to rise. They spend it at its maximum value.
And the regular guy gets screwed.
By the time that money trickles down to the average working man, the guy who is actually building houses, laying pipe, writing code inflation, has already ravaged the economy. Prices for groceries, housing, and gas have skyrocketed.
So his purchasing power is destroyed.
Yes. The book frames inflation not just as an accidental economic phenomenon, but as a deliberate, hidden, invisible tax. It is a mathematical system that systematically steals the stored energy, time, and labor of men to fund the ever-expanding gynocentric welfare state.
But Riker argues that you cannot fight this massive economic and spiritual war if your own biology is compromised. He has a whole section on the physiology of the modern man, and it is pretty alarming. He cites a heavily referenced 2013 study by Levine et al., published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. What did that study find, and how does Riker use it?
The Levine study showed a staggering generational collapse in male testosterone levels. We're talking about a population-wide drop of more than 50% since the 1970s. A 25-year-old man today has roughly half the testosterone his grandfather had at the same age.
That is terrifying. How does Riker explain it? Because the mainstream explanation is usually obesity or sedentary lifestyles.
Riker acknowledges those factors, but he frames this collapse not as an environmental accident, but as a direct biological assault. He blames the pervasive use of endocrine-disrupting chemicals in plastics and water supplies, coupled with a cultural push toward highly processed, estrogenic diets that specifically suppress masculine vitality.
It's chemical warfare.
He points to this physiological collapse as the reason men are currently losing the culture war. He urges men to aggressively reject what he refers to as the soy boy phenotype.
And how does he describe the soy boy?
He describes this phenotype as physically weak, low energy, highly emotional, docile, and metabolically broken. The argument is that a man with the testosterone levels of an elderly woman simply does not possess the biological drive, the aggression, or the mental fortitude required to stand up to the matrix, assert his boundaries, or defend his resources.
So what is the prescription? What does the author recommend a guy listening to this right now actually do to fix his physiology? Because Riker gets very specific, almost like a biohacking manual.
He prescribes a rigorous, almost militant regimen. First, he demands men get extensive, comprehensive blood work to see exactly where their hormone levels are. And he advocates for aggressive optimization, including testosterone replacement therapy if necessary.
So it's dialing it in.
Second, he is a massive proponent of the Wim Hof method, which involves deep breathing exercises and intense, deliberate cold exposure, like ice baths.
What is the point of the ice baths? Is it just to prove you're tough?
Riker argues it's a neurological hack. He claims cold exposure directly stimulates the vagus nerve, forcing the body to manage panic and adapt to extreme stress. It builds a neurochemical shield against depression, anxiety, and the emotional turbulence of modern life.
Building armor.
Finally, he heavily promotes strict carnivore or animal-based diets. The book argues that a diet consisting almost entirely of red meat, organs, and animal fats provides the dense bioavailable nutrients required to optimize testosterone, clear brain fog, and build the metabolic resilience necessary to withstand the psychological warfare and shit tests of the modern matriarchy.
Okay, so a man fixes his body, he optimizes his hormones, he sharpens his mind with classical logic. What is the macro solution? How does he actually apply this in the real world to escape the matrix we've been talking about?
Once a man has secured his physiology and his mind, the book outlines its core tactical advice for navigating the socio-economic landscape, the man strike.
The man strike, that sounds like a labor union concept.
It is essentially a labor strike, but on a civilizational scale. This aligns closely with internet philosophies like MGTOW, or men going their own way, or what is often called monk mode.
Okay.
The premise is a coordinated, strategic withdrawal of male surplus labor from a system that the author claims inherently hates and exploits men.
So John Galt going to Galt's Gulch in Atlas Shrugged.
Very similar. Riker argues that if the gynocentric state relies entirely on male competence, male infrastructure maintenance, and male tax revenue to fund its existence, then the only moral and logical action for a self-respecting man is to starve the beast.
Just walk away.
He urges men to minimize their taxable footprint.
Yeah.
He tells them to refuse to participate in the corporate rat race, refuse to strive for upper management positions where their surplus value is taxed away, and absolutely under no circumstances sign the marriage contract.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Does a guy just quit his job and go live in a cabin in the woods? Because Riker introduces this concept of the ghost walk and jurisdictional divergence. That sounds a lot more sophisticated than just hiding in the forest.
It is much more sophisticated.
Yeah.
It is essentially geopolitical arbitrage. The ghost walk is the process of quietly disappearing from the matrix without making a scene. Jurisdictional divergence advises high-earning men to physically take their bodies to low cost, developing countries that still hold traditional patriarchal values.
Like where?
Places in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, or Latin America where the book claims men are still viewed as respected providers rather than toxic oppressors.
Live where you are treated best.
Exactly. But while his physical body is on a beach in Thailand, The book advises parking his actual wealth in impenetrable legal structures like offshore trusts. However, Riker argues that traditional fiat banking is still too vulnerable to government overreach. The ultimate weapon in this strategic asset protection, according to the final tactical chapters of the book, is Bitcoin.
This is where the tech aspect comes in. And he frames Bitcoin as more than just a stock or an investment to make money on. He frames it as a philosophical weapon. How does he contrast the architecture of crypto with his theories on gender dynamics? I know he talks about proof of work versus proof of stake. Break that down for us.
Yes. The text frames Bitcoin as the ultimate expression of masculine sovereignty. To understand this, you have to look at the consensus mechanisms of cryptocurrency. Bitcoin operates on proof of work. It requires massive amounts of physical energy, computational power, and literal labor to mine a block and secure the network.
You have to earn it.
Riker aligns proof of work with the masculine principles of logos, merit, undeniable energy expenditure, and objective truth. You cannot fake the work. You either expended the energy or you didn't.
And he contrasts that with proof of stake, which is what networks like Ethereum use.
Correct. In proof of stake, whoever already holds the most coins gets to validate the network and earn more coins, simply by virtue of already being rich. No physical energy is required.
Just entitlement.
Riker metaphorically links proof of stake to feminine entitlement, unearned privilege, and the fiat welfare state, where rewards are distributed based on status rather than productive labor.
That is a wild analogy. So why does Bitcoin protect the man on the ghost walk?
Because Bitcoin can be held in absolute self-custody. By memorizing a 12-word seed phrase, a man can hold billions of dollars of wealth entirely in his own head.
It's unconfiscatable.
Riker frames this as a decentralized cryptographic fortress. It is an asset that is entirely immune to the confiscation of family court judges, immune to the freezing of bank accounts by angry bureaucrats, and immune to the inflationary printing of the central banking system. It is unseizable property.
Which brings us to the climax of the book's philosophy, chapter 16, the omega point of masculine sovereignty. Riker looks out into the distant future, specifically focusing on the technological singularity and the rise of artificial superintelligence, or ASI. Most people are terrified of AI taking over the world, like Skynet and Terminator, but Riker views ASI as a savior. Why?
Riker views artificial superintelligence as the ultimate unbiased arbiter of pure truth. The argument is that an algorithm is perfectly logocentric, it cannot be shamed on social media, it cannot be canceled by a mob, and crucially, it cannot be guilt-tripped by female tears.
It just looks at the code.
The author predicts that when ASI begins analyzing the global economy, it will finally, ruthlessly expose the cold, hard fiscal reality of the matriarchy. It will process the raw data of male production versus female consumption without the distorting filter of feminist ideology or the empathy gap.
He believes the AI will look at the math and realize men are getting a raw deal, but he takes it even further into sci-fi territory with something he calls the ultimate paternal escape. He believes technology is going to solve the biological imperative entirely.
Yes, this is his endgame scenario. The author predicts that emerging technologies, specifically the perfection of artificial wombs or ectogenesis, and the creation of highly advanced, hyper-realistic ASI romantic companions will eventually completely decouple male reproduction and male companionship from female biological gatekeeping.
So a man won't need a woman to have a child, and he won't need a woman for intimacy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The central thesis of the entire book is that women have used their monopoly on reproduction and intimacy to leverage resources and labor from men for millennia. Riker argues that once technology breaks that monopoly, the biological leverage instantly evaporates.
The ultimate game changer.
When a man can have a biological child grown in an artificial womb and experience intimacy with an AI that never nags, never ages, and never files for divorce, the profound shift in the balance of civilizational power will be absolute.
That is a staggering dystopian or utopian, depending on your view, prediction. But until that sci-fi future arrives, the book delivers a final, urgent call to action for the men of today. He says men must build the New Jerusalem right now. What does that actually entail?
Riker commands men to stop trying to reform the current system because he believes it is fundamentally captured and corrupted. Instead, they must build parallel, decentralized institutions completely free from the influence of HR departments, diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, and cultural Marxism.
So literally building a separate economy.
Yes. This means building untraceable gig economies where men trade skills directly for crypto. It means founding decentralized crypto banks that lend capital strictly based on merit, business plans, and proof of work, rather than ESG scores or victimhood status. And crucially, it means creating robust, independent media networks to preserve the classical virtues of logic, strength, and Western civilization against the cultural tide of Eros.
If we synthesize this incredibly dense, aggressively paradigm-shifting journey we've just been on, Riker paints a stark, uncompromising picture of reality. He describes a world where the fundamental social contract between men and women, and between men and the state, has been entirely breached. And his answer isn't to complain. It's to require men to strategically, systematically withdraw their consent, their labor, and their resources. His ultimate vision is for men to starve the beast, step away, and rebuild a logocentric civilization based entirely on merit, strength, and stoicism, leaving the current decaying system to inevitably collapse under the weight of its own unearned entitlement.
It is a massive, highly structured worldview. And before we conclude this deep dive, I must deliver a final vital reminder to you, the listener, regarding our strict impartiality. We have explicitly stated throughout this episode that the arguments, the sociological syllogisms, and the historical reinterpretations unpacked today are intense, highly polarizing, and deeply controversial.
We're just reporting the text.
Our purpose today was strictly analytical. We aim to provide you with a clear, unfiltered, comprehensive window into the exact worldview and logical frameworks proposed by Conrad Riker. We are meticulously analyzing the text as a cultural document. We are not endorsing its conclusions, nor are we validating its historical claims.
Absolutely. We are simply the guides, here to decode the source material so you can understand the arguments shaping these subcultures.
With that in mind, I want to leave you with a final, lingering, provocative thought to mull over on your own, one that builds on the text's final chapters regarding the singularity and AI.
Let's hear it.
If the author's ultimate prediction holds true that artificial intelligence, artificial wombs, and decentralized finance will eventually completely remove all human emotion, vulnerability, and biological leverage from the equation of human survival and reproduction, what does the future of human relationships actually look like in a purely logocentric, mathematically governed world? If the friction, the compromise, and the emotional chaos of biology are removed entirely, do we evolve into superior beings of pure reason and sovereignty? Or, by eliminating the struggle of human connection, do we lose something fundamentally, irreplaceably human in the process?
That is a massive existential question to ponder. And listen, if this deep dive opened your eyes, if it challenged your core beliefs, if it made you angry, or if it gave you an entirely new structural framework for understanding the arguments currently driving the modern manosphere, you absolutely must read the source material in its entirety to see exactly how the author lays out the data and the philosophy. I need you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive, and immediately go check out Help. My Wife is an Evil Bitch by Conrad Riker. It is a massive read, and it is available for purchase right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And to stay updated with the author's ongoing dispatches, essays, and theories from the front lines of this culture war, make absolutely sure you are following @Conrad N. Riker on his Substack. Thank you for taking this intense, challenging journey with us today, and we will see you on the next deep dive.